Yeah, I decided to skip on ADG mod this week. Part of the reason why I started making pro and mod videos was so I could play DOS games I felt like playing, but all of my options for mod videos at the moment are stuff I don't feel like playing, or it'd take a very large amount of time to cover properly. So I decided to sub in a standard review. So for today's Ancient DOS game, we're taking a look at one of the few commercial titles I've owned since starting ADG, which I hadn't yet gotten around to. Fast Break. As is plainly obvious, Fast Break is a basketball game, and while it wasn't the first one released for DOS, it's definitely one of the more detailed ones for its time, despite lacking any sort of licensing of real players or teams, at least as far as I'm aware. And as for how it plays, well, it's okay. It's nothing spectacular, and definitely has more of a simulation feel to it than an action feel, but given the limitations of the hardware this was tasked to run on, it still ends up being a solid experience. Well, it does have some minor quirks, and we'll absolutely go over them, but there's nothing too crazy to worry about. I mean, aside from the fact that there doesn't seem to be a quit button. Yeah, I'm really not sure why, but Fast Break completely lacks a button or key combination to quit the DOS, at least as far as I'm aware. It wouldn't be weird at all if it was a booter game, but you load this game from the command prompt, even on other computers it was developed for, like the Commodore 64. It's not really a big deal emulated, but it means if you're running this on actual DOS hardware, be prepared to hit the reset button or Control-Alt-Delete when you're done playing. Fast Break was developed and published by Accolade in 1988 and is a 1 to 2 player basketball game. It supports monochrome Hercules, 4-color CJ, and 16-color Tandy and EGA graphics, but only PC speaker sound. And as for its current release date, it's still commercial and has a few quirks to keep in mind if you intend to try and get a copy. First of all, most copies of Fast Break that you'll find out there are very well priced, typically going for between $10 and $15 for a complete in-box copy. But you're also pretty much only going to be finding the C64 and Amiga versions. I wasn't able to source a single DOS copy of the game online when searching for it. So it's safe to say if you're going for the DOS version, it may be harder to acquire and potentially more expensive. Well, then maybe not. Sports titles rarely hold their value well because so many updates and re-releases occur which reuse engines with new team rosters and maybe an extra feature or two. Does they saturate the market to some degree? And plus there's absolutely better basketball games out there than this one. So you typically wouldn't buy this game nowadays to actually play it on a regular basis. You'd be doing it more for collecting purposes. But one of the main difficulties you're going to face trying to acquire this game can be blamed on an entirely different game which came out only a year later called Magic Johnson's Fast Break, which saw a much wider release onto even more platforms due to the name recognition of famous basketball player Magic Johnson. I'd say out of all the results which came up when searching for Fast Break, about 90% of them were the Magic Johnson game and not this one. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're searching out this game in particular. When you first start up Fast Break, you're shown half of the court and are given some very simple options. You can set the length of each quarter in real time from 3 to 12 minutes. You can select which teams will be computer controlled or human controlled, though you can't set both as computers. At least one of them has to have a real person behind it. Though I think there might be a secret way to get the computer to play both teams. I just don't remember if that's a thing or not. And then all you do is you can either start a game, run practice mode when the computer's not involved, or run the playmaker for either team. Now I should point out that even though each player has their own movement and firing controls, the spacebar is used as a general advancement key for all circumstances. So for right here on this menu screen, you'd use either player's fire button to change what an option is, but for starting a game, you need to press the spacebar. It's a little weird, but it's nothing too complicated. The games themselves are 3-on-3, and there's 2 different teams you can play as in the game, each of which has a roster of 6 players, 2 for each position. Now before starting each quarter, you're able to adjust which player is primed for each position, each of whom has a basic description to give you an idea of how they play. Now behind the scenes, each player has stats in place internally for how fast they run, how high they jump, their 2-point accuracy, their 3-point accuracy, how well they both hold onto and steal the ball, and how well they can block a shot or inbound the ball from a failed shot. And while the descriptions can help you figure out a lot of this, the game never flat out tells you any of these stats. You'll also notice each player has ongoing stats listed for field goals and field goal attempts, total number of points earned, personal fouls, steals, and turnovers. Now, most of those are obvious, though the one that isn't, turnovers, is when the player loses the ball to the opposing team, either by having the ball stolen from them or from an intercepted pass or blocked shot. You can also access your playbook from this screen to select which 4 offensive plays you want to have primed and ready for when you need them, including what's referred to as the special play, which is essentially a custom play you can put together using the playmaker before starting the game. All teams get the same 4 defensive plays at all times, so you can't select anything in that regards. Once you start playing the game itself, you're going to find it's actually very straightforward and plays pretty much exactly as you'd expect a basketball game to play. And when you don't have the ball, you can tap the fire button to select which player you're directly controlling, while the AI will control the other 2 players, or you can hold the fire button down to jump in an attempt to block shots or inbound the ball once it falls off the basket without going in. And when you do have the ball, you can tap the fire button to attempt to pass it to a teammate, generally whoever you're facing, or you can hold the fire button down to take a shot at the basket. So that's the basics, but obviously there's a lot more to basketball than that. So how does the game handle all the little details? Well, for starters, getting the ball in the basket is all about timing. As soon as your player's feet leave the ground to make a shot, the game checks if it's going to be 2 points or 3 points, along with when you actually release the fire button. The timing is that you want to let go of the fire button as close to the apex of your jump as possible to get the highest possible chance of making the basket. Now, if the ball goes straight through the hoop with a swoosh, then you had a perfect shot. If it bounces on or rolls around the rim before going in, then your shot wasn't perfect, but was still good enough to pass the accuracy check. But then, how do you steal the ball so you can get the edge on the opposing team? Well, this is handled a bit more automatically. Basically, if 2 opposing players, one of whom has the ball, are very close to each other and facing each other, then a check is constantly being performed to see if the player without the ball will take it from the player who has it. Now, this check is based on how well the player without the ball can steal it versus how well the player with the ball can keep it. The only trick here is if the 2 players actually collide, as that'd be a violation, in which case it depends on who has the ball and what direction the players are moving in. Though the game absolutely favors calling charging on the ball handler over fouls on the player trying to block. So keep in mind, if you have the ball, you probably don't want to run head first into an opponent. This is kind of where the whole simulation aspect of the game starts to come into play, seeing as it's very easy to put yourself into a situation where you're guaranteed to lose the ball. After your opponent scores a goal and you pick up the ball to send it inbound to one of your teammates, if you send the ball to a teammate who has poor ball handling, who suddenly finds themselves having to somehow get by an opponent who can easily steal the ball with all the other players already on the other side of the field, well, you're losing that ball. You have to absolutely be paying attention to the traits of your teammates and who you're controlling at all times if you want to win. Well, naturally, this might translate into you just doing a bunch of dunks, having your fastest player always be the one to bring the ball right past everything and straight into the basket. Sounds all well and good, and it'll work great for a little, until you start finding it surprisingly difficult to get the ball in the basket. So another thing the game is tracking, which it doesn't tell you about, is fatigue. The harder you work a particular player, the worse their ball handling and shooting becomes. However, they can slowly recover fatigue if you swap them out for their alternates. But you may have to change up your playstyle to account for the shift in the balance of your team's traits. The other trick to scoring is using your plays. Now, once all players are present on one side of the field, the player with the ball has the option of going up to the halfway line, which will pause the action to an extent while bringing up the playbook. Now, both players must then choose to either make a play or not make a play. Everyone will then follow their plays, save for the active players, the ones being controlled directly. So it's just a matter of seeing if it all plays out the way you want it to, or expect it to, while doing your best to either make a basket or prevent your opponent from doing the same. I should mention too that while the game is tracking charging and fouls, along with a couple other violations related to the 24-second ball timer and a 10-second rule related to getting the ball again after a failed shot, most violations aren't tracked in the game because they're not possible. You'll never see double dribbles, traveling, or anything related to things which have been fully automated or completely prevented. Which, let's face it, that's how it should be. Well, there's nothing wrong with trying to bring realism into a sports title. You have to draw the line somewhere so that what you end up with is still fun and approachable by everyone. Overall, Fast Break is a decent basketball sim for when it came out, but it's completely overshadowed by games which came out not too long after it. I wouldn't call it perfect because there's a lot of things they could have done to make it even better, such as by having even more players and teams, by providing more stats and info to help you make better calls as to when to swap players. And quite frankly, the playbook system is handled in kind of a weak way and rarely comes into effect. Well, it's fun to play for sure, but very limiting in what you can do with it. And once you've beaten it a couple times, you'll probably already be wanting to go play something else. It just doesn't have any staying power. Not anymore. Thankfully, setting this up in DOSBox is incredibly simple, as you just have to leave cycles set to auto and you're good to go. However, one thing I should absolutely mention is that the keyboard controls are a joke, since you can't hold multiple keys at a time. I highly recommend either playing with a joystick or gamepad, or if you don't have one, use DOSBox's keymapper to remap joystick functions to keyboard keys. It seriously makes that big of a difference. Anywho, that'll be all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 270 will be next Saturday on the 13th, and we'll be taking a look at one of the later DOS games to be released during DOS's practical lifetime that's often likened to the MechWarrior games, at least in terms of its presentation. So make sure to stay tuned to see this game in action. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.